Penguin Random House Canada presents The Coming Bad Days by Sarah Bernstein. Read for you by the author. This blue and windy book is for Tricia, for Hillary. 1. I left the man with whom I'd been living one morning in late summer, after opening the wardrobe and seeing the tidy line of his shirt collars, white and blue, white and blue. I felt sick. I began to see my life rolling out in front of me, and it looked like the street on which we then lived, with the blue and green and white houses and the red and yellow doors. And I could discern in the distance the seasons rolling in, and the apples falling in the orchard, and the windows freezing shut, and the blue smell of spring, and the children in the wading pool in the baked summer light. And I knew that underneath it all were these hard and secret things. Prior to this moment, which proved in fact to be a decisive one in the course of my life, I had been afraid of being alone. The notion that I was free in theory but also in practice to do whatever I liked with my life was terrifying. It was nothing short of a nightmare. I moved to a low-stone cottage on a street of low-stone cottages. Soon it was autumn and the windows looked out onto the night, which fell promptly at 4:30 in the afternoon. All around me was quiet. During the day, I sat at my desk and felt the light drain from the bedroom as the sun moved out of the eastern sky. I watched the trees submit to the passing of the seasons. Various birds came and went. Occasionally, I ventured into the garden to collect leaves into a brown bin assigned to the address by the council, or else to cut back the ivy that grew around the garden's perimeter. During these several months of making unsuccessful job applications from my desk, which was wide and beautiful, oak, I began to travel by train to the city nearby with some frequency. At first, I had a fear of taking the train by myself. I had read a story about a girl who got on a train one night and was found dead weeks later in a forest far away. The local news affiliates circulated an image of this girl taken from CCTV footage. In the still, she was standing on the railway platform wearing an expression that seemed to me familiar. In short, the story about this girl confirmed what I had long suspected, namely that journeys of this kind, taken alone, taken by women, end in self-annihilation. I began to appreciate being amongst things that were mine only. I cleaned with a puritanical zeal. I found a rug beater and dragged the living room rug into the garden. I scrubbed the floorboards on my hands and knees. I scoured away all evidence of the cottage's past inhabitants, any hint that lives had been lived in the place before mine. Each morning I rose early and walked up a hill. From there, I could see the sea, the city, and more hills rising gently out of the land. I stood on this hill in the fog, in the sun, in the early morning rain, often in the cloud and more rarely in the snow, and felt triumphant. The vital thing, the absolutely most vital thing, is not to let anybody get to the bottom of you. I had around that time been awarded my PhD for a thesis on poetry in the Maghreb, literature about which I cared deeply, and at once found myself in the position of having to apply for jobs. My research was met with contempt from administrators and hiring panels alike, who customarily rejected my applications outright, although, and this was less common, I was now and then required to submit to routinely humiliating interviews. My professional, not to mention personal failures at this time, were so complete that to this day I wonder whether I would not have been better off taking my own life. In the end, I was too cowardly to carry out even this pitiful act of self-assertion, though I had the means close to hand. I arrived at last at the point at which the heroine should pull herself up by the so-to-speak bootstraps and succeed against all odds and on her own terms. Instead, after several weeks of drinking quantities of gin in my pajamas, I elected to give in to the exigencies of the world as it was. Having never read Celan, I chose a new research topic: speech and silence, Paul Celan and the transcendental, more or less at random. The department that finally took me on, defined under such broad areas of categorization as English and comparative literatures, was chaired by a man whose research profile comprised only the words, "The Rhetoric of John Donne." I felt I understood the requirements of the post. I eschewed all personal relationships except insofar as they dealt expediently and discreetly with specific physical yearnings. I never invited colleagues to my home that in any case was outside of the city, and I did not fraternize with students outside of the cold seminar rooms, except during my office hours, from which they often left crying. As a result of this, my work, which had yet to generate any material output, and indeed was unlikely ever to do so, was considered serious if somewhat obscure, and I was left to my own devices. The presiding instincts of the university department that engaged me were those of tribalism and aggression. Colleagues disappeared with a regularity I found at first alarming, but to which in fact I acclimatized quite rapidly. The sustained and targeted campaigns of harassment affected some more than others, to be sure. Their objectives were barely concealed. And yet I knew implicitly that recovering any evidence as to precisely what had happened would have been impossible. Besides, up until then, my presence had barely registered, and I had no interest in sticking my head above the proverbial parapet. I sat in my office reading Celan, and at lunchtime ate a cheese sandwich standing by the window, watching my female colleagues furtively cross the quadrangle. At least once a week I witnessed one being waylaid by undergraduates and carried off into a doorway. I knew most of these women by sight, having encountered them either at the monthly staff meetings or else at the department's weekly seminars, both of which, the latter in particular, were exercises in barbarism. Each Wednesday lunchtime, the elected member of staff would stand in front of a podium and lecture for an hour upon a subject of his or her choosing, at intervals reaching out a trembling hand for a sip of water. At the end of this hour, my colleagues took turns decimating the speaker, undermining his or her argument and by extension his or her life's work, or else, and indeed just as often, casting aspersions on his or her personal life. After this, we held a wine reception. I felt I fitted in quite well, but one day, arriving at my office, I found a note tucked under the door. Sometimes this genius goes dark and sinks down into the bitter well of his heart. When Celan jumped to his death on an April day in Paris, incidentally and perhaps by no small coincidence my own birthday, he left a biography of Holderlin lying open on his desk with these words underlined. I had given no reason for anyone to think I was possessed of genius. I had arrived in the post via the careful cultivation of an aura of tedious scholarliness, in fact modeled upon a man I once loved, and who had treated me as a perennial distraction from his important intellectual work. My most recent involvement, in reality the only person with whom I had been involved since I left the man with the blue and white shirts, ended our relationship via email 5 days before Christmas, citing as a reason his sadness, which was the result of a series of personal traumas dating back to his childhood, the memories of which he had not, he admitted, altogether recovered. My failure to respond generated a series of further missives that continue to this day, in which he outlined, amongst other things, his new lover's outlook on his cock, which, he wrote, I might recollect curved inwards at an angle of approximately 40 degrees. What can I say? A man wants a cipher. At night, I lay awake listening to the police helicopters that had been dispatched in great numbers following the disappearance of 2 girls. The searches brought up nothing in spite of the increased presence of these vehicles, whose spotlights roved through the dark streets and even occasionally came through windows, patches alighting briefly upon a desk, say, or on a person looking out at the night. By day, I sat in my office, filling notebooks with quotations that had no discernible relationship to one another, except a pleasing sound. I had difficulty organizing my ideas, which I could only catch in a peripheral way. I felt vacuous and degenerate and, when confronted with contact with other people, utterly contentless. I thought more often of the note slipped under my door and watched my colleagues closely at the Wednesday seminars. I wondered whether any of these people had the wherewithal to write out the words in blue ink, to fold the slip of paper and clandestinely to slide it underneath my office door.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?